All right. Well, thank you. Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here with you today, and I'm looking forward to talking with you on various topics. The first is going to be the intro and DCAA overview. So I'll just go ahead and get right started. Okay. So as you know, contract audit has been a prudent and necessary part of the DoD procurement process for many years. From about 1948 to 1965, each of the military services had its own internal contract audit function. In December of 1964, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara decided that the contract audit function could be performed more effectively and efficiently by a single independent audit organization. Accordingly, DCAA was established in 1965 by transferring all of the existing audit functions, contract audit functions from each of the military services into a single contract audit agency. And as you know, DCAA stands for Defense Contract Audit Agency. We have oversight of about 9,000 contractors every year. We perform more than 3,400 audits and examine more than $350 billion of contractor cost. So this slide here is our agency mission. Together with our acquisition partners, we increase warfighter capabilities by delivering high quality audits and financial services to achieve fair and reasonable prices that protect taxpayer dollars. So again, if you think about our role within the financial oversight, okay, our role is critical to ensure that DoD gets the best value for every dollar spent on defense contracting. So that's why our mission includes, performing audits and financial services, and we want to get the best value for the taxpayers because, at the end of the day, all of these contracts, these are all taxpayer funded contracts. Okay. Now, if we look at DCAA from a kind of a 30,000 foot level, we have about 4,600 employees. We're located all over the US and overseas. We have about 300 offices, mostly in the US, but we do have several overseas. I know we have an office in Wiesbaden, Germany. We might have some satellite offices in Iraq. And I know we have an office in Hawaii. Okay. Now, like I mentioned, our responsibilities and duties, because we are a DoD agency, we perform all needed contract audits for DoD. We have a group of financial liaison advisors. They're auditors, but we call them FLA for short, financial liaison advisors, and they provide accounting and financial services to DoD and non-DoD, and they assist throughout the various contract phases. Okay, now I mentioned here non-DoD. We do some work for non-DoD. We typically refer to them as civilian agencies. So, if you're a small business out there and you have contracts with non-DoD, there is a chance, a small chance, but there is a chance that you could be audited by DCAA. All right, this slide here just shows where DCAA is placed within the overall organization. As you can see, we operate under the authority, direction, and control of the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. This placement ensures that we have independence, okay, from the other services, right? So the Army, Navy, Air Force, those organizations make procurement decisions. They have contracting officers that make procurement decisions. They award contracts, they fund contracts, they determine whether your accounting system is adequate, so on and so forth. And so, this organizational placement is important because we want to have objectivity and transparency with our audit report. Okay. This is one of the standards that we follow. As an auditor, we have to follow government auditing standards. We also refer to them as Yellow Book. And so having this type of independence is very important because, like I said, it lends credibility to our report, but it also meets very strict auditing standards, government auditing standards. Okay. Now, this slide here just shows DCAA's organization. Anita Bells is our director. Joe Bentz is our deputy director. Along the left side are the groups within headquarters. So my position, I fall under operations. The middle column are, we call them regions. There's 3 of them: Eastern, Central, and Western. Field detachment is just a group of auditors that audit classified contracts. So, if you don't have any classified work, then I wouldn't worry about FD. And then the last column on the far right, DCAA has organized itself around the very big defense contractors, as you can see: Northrop Grumman and Boeing, GED, Raytheon, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, as a contractor, you'll fall within one of the regions or the CAD. Okay. Now, obviously, if you're a small business, right, you're going to fall within one of the regions. Okay. And so now, what region do you fall in? Well, it's just a matter of where you're located geographically. Okay. So here, as you can see, the gray area represents Eastern, the orange is our central region, and then the green is Western. So again, depending on where you are located, where your books and records are located, you would fall under your respective region. Now, if you're, I know I'm speaking with the Maryland PTAC, so I'm assuming most of you listening are probably from the Maryland area, maybe even perhaps Delaware or even Virginia. But as you can see, all those areas that I mentioned you will fall under, if you're a small business in any of those areas, you will fall under the Eastern region. And then again, as you can see throughout the country, we do have our various CAD locations. Okay, in Northern Virginia, we have the Northrop Grumman CAD in McLean, Virginia. All right, so one of the many common questions that I get from small businesses is they'll ask, who is my cognizant DCAA office? Okay, so normally I get this question because you haven't been audited by DCAA. If you have, normally you would know who that office is. Okay, so normally or typically, if you're a new small business or if you've never had the requirement to be audited, then you're not going to know who your office is. Okay, so we have a locator function on our website, www.dcaa.mil. If you go to the locator tab and then to the US CONUS, you'll get this screen here. You would just select the type of search and then enter that in, and then your office should pop up. Okay. Now, again, I will warn you, if you are a new small business or DCAA has never audited you in the past, okay, you're not going to be in our system, right? So this function isn't going to necessarily work. Okay. You could try the zip code. Okay, depending on your zip code, you might get some search results there. But either way, if this doesn't work and you can't get your office, I would just recommend contacting me. I can look that up and I can provide that information to you. Okay. Now, one of the other questions I'll get is, people will ask, hey, what is the most common audit that DCAA performs? Well, this slide here just sort of attempts to sort of discuss some of the audits that we can perform throughout the phases of the award. By far, the largest in terms of volume, the largest audit, or I should say the work or the audits that represent the majority of our effort is going to be accounting system and incur costs. I apologize. The audits that represent the majority of our work is going to be proposals, cost proposals, and incur costs. So those two audits, those two assignments, I think consist about 60%, 65% of the work that we do. So a fairly large portion of our work is just those two areas alone. However, we do other work as well, as you can see. And again, this is broken out by the phases of the award. So typically before contract award, I mentioned cost proposal, but the other audit we can do is what's called an accounting system audit or a pre-award accounting system audit. Okay, and if you've been with us in the past, in prior webinars, I'm sure you've heard me talk about the accounting system requirements, and these typically kick in when you're being awarded cost reimbursable contracts. Okay. Now, throughout the contract, during contract execution, I mentioned annual incurred costs. That's a big one. Okay, so most of you out there, you probably have heard of that audit. That's a very kind of a well-known, or in terms of the audits that we do, I would say most people have at least heard of an incurred cost. However, we could do a lot of other different things as well. Okay, so we can do what's called a real-time labor evaluation, where we look at, in real time, we'll come out to your location and we'll review your timesheets and talk to employees and so on and so forth. Okay, we can also do what's called provisional billing rates. We can also review progress payments and vouchers, right? So these are all, some different things that we can do throughout contract execution. Then at the end of the contract, when the contract is complete, you deliver all of your goods and services to the government, and we are now ready to close out the contract. DCA can assist in what's called the final voucher, okay? Or in some situations, a contract may get terminated early, and if certain requirements are met, DCAA can audit what's called a termination settlement proposal, okay? So next slide. So these are all of the available presentations that we have on our public website. I've given these topics numerous times through Maryland PTAC. So today we'll be going over, in addition to this intro and overview, I'll also talk about the audit process and then contract briefs as well. But again, like I said, these are all available on our public website, so I highly recommend you check them out. Okay, now some more resources that we have here. As you can see, we have a lot of checklists. So this, these checklists are here to help, if you're submitting a cost proposal, right? If you're submitting an incurred cost proposal, if you're submitting a pre-award accounting system checklist, then these resources here are, they're here to help you in terms of making sure you have everything in place, so that when DCAA goes to audit you, okay, everything is there, right? I would also note that we have what's called an ICE model, or the incur cost electronically model. Okay, so that's, for if you're a new small business and you've never put one together, and then all of a sudden you have to, I would take a look at that. Okay, it's a nice place to start without reinventing the wheel. Okay, so next slide. So here, our public website, we do have some guidance on here under the customers tab, and then guidance. As you can see, we have a lot of information, CAS and FAR and DFARs. We also have what's called the CAM, which is our contract audit manual. Okay, I mentioned our government auditing standards that we follow. Okay, that's second from the bottom. It's called GAGAS for short, Generally Accepted Government Auditing Standards. But I would also mention, which I think is important, is the Directory of Audit Programs. That's the second from the top. So if you're going through an audit, if you're going to go through a DCAA audit, okay, I would check out the Directory of Audit Programs. Okay, so what DCAA has done internally, we developed these audit programs, and there's one for every audit that we perform, or I would say virtually every audit, maybe not every audit, but I would say the majority of audits that we perform, we have an audit program. And so what the audit program does, it helps the audit team plan and perform the audit. So all that information that's all public information. So I think it would be a great benefit to a contractor if you're going to go through, let's say, an incurred cost audit, and you go to our public website, you can look at the audit program for incurred costs, and you'll have all of the information that DCAA has in terms of what we use to plan and perform the audit. Okay, so you'll know what the purpose of the audit, right? You'll know some of the standard audit objectives that we're trying to meet. Okay, you'll understand some of the criteria that we'll use in which we evaluate your accounting system, or evaluating the allowability of costs. Okay, so on and so forth. So I think that's an invaluable tool there. Okay. So I mentioned checklists, and I mentioned the ICE model. You can find that here under customers, and then checklists and tools. And then if you go to the small business link here, you'll find all of the presentations that I mentioned. Also, you'll see my focal point, my number, and my email as well. So again, if you have any questions about anything that we discussed today, or just in general, I would, feel free to reach out to me. I can certainly help you out. All right. Okay, and that brings me to the end of the intro. So I will go ahead and bring up the next presentation, the audit process. And I would also like to mention, as I go, if there are questions, feel free to, take yourself off mute, ask the question, or if you want to maybe type in the question, and Yasmin can go ahead and just interrupt me and just, ask the question that way. So whatever you prefer. I'm pretty casual. So, I want this to be kind of an informal process. So, all right, well, I'm going to just go ahead and move forward then, and we'll talk about the audit process. Okay, and so, really the goal or the objective of this presentation is sort of to help you understand a little bit about what you can expect during a typical DCAA audit. Okay, now every audit is going to be a little bit different. Every audit team, will do things a little bit differently. Every audit, right? Every auditor, I guess I should say, every auditor will do things a little bit different. So, your experience may vary very slightly, but there are some sort of touch points, right, or milestones throughout the audit that are not going to change, right? There are just certain things in every audit that you should expect to see. Okay, and that's kind of the goal for this discussion, is sort of help give you some insight and kind of break down some of those barriers, if you will, to an audit. Okay, because it's really not a very complicated process, but I think the first part, I think what's really important is to sort of understand the process, so that it kind of demystifies it a little bit. It's not really this horrible thing that, or it shouldn't be, at least. So and anyway, so when we talk about the audit process, we'll go over these sort of main touch points, right? We'll talk about the adequacy. Okay, communication is very big, right? That's a very very big topic, and we'll talk about that as well. There's various points where we'll have communication throughout an audit. We'll talk about site visits, and then also requests for information. Okay. Now, at the start of every audit, okay, the very first thing that an auditor will do is to perform what's called an adequacy review. Okay. Now, what are we reviewing for adequacy? Okay. So every audit has to have some sort of assertion. Okay. So assertion is sort of a technical term, I guess you should say. I guess for people that are sort of in the audit world, okay, we understand what assertion means, but assertion basically is something the contractor asserts to. Okay, so the contractor is making some sort of assertion, right? Whether it's your forward pricing proposal, okay, whether it's your cost price proposal, okay, maybe it's a final indirect rate proposal, right, aka incur cost. Maybe it's your pre-award accounting system design, okay. So at the start of every audit, DCAA will perform an adequacy review of that assertion to make sure that it is adequate before we start an audit. Okay, so again, this is the very first thing that we're going to do. So, what does this mean to you as a small business? Well, it's very important that when you put together your assertion, whether it's a cost price proposal, whether it's an incur cost proposal, it's very important that you develop your proposal and you put it together in accordance with all of the regulation. So FAR and DFARS actually provides instructions in terms of how to put together, your cost proposal or an incur cost proposal. Okay, so it's important to understand what those are, and that when you put it together, you do it in a way that it's adequate, so that when DCAA reviews it for adequacy, okay, everything's going to be there. Okay, we don't want a situation where we kick it back and say, hey, this is inadequate, all right, and then you have to take time to work on it and then submit it again, right? So we want to limit kind of that back and forth, right? Because we realize That takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources, okay? Now, as we move forward in the audit, right, let's assume that DCAA reviews the assertion for adequacy and it's found adequate, okay? Shortly after that, okay, DCAA will contact the contract, will contact you and will conduct what's called an entrance conference, all right? And an entrance conference is typically, it includes the contractor's personnel, in addition to DCAA, the audit team. Okay, so the audit team can be, it can be as small as the auditor and supervisor, or it can be as large as the auditor, the lead auditor, maybe one or two assisting auditors, the supervisor, the branch manager, maybe even the RAM. Okay, so, again, it depends. If it's a very large audit, it may have, a larger team. Okay, if it's a smaller audit or something that we sort of do on a routine basis, it might just be the auditor and the supervisor. Okay. Now, in terms of the contractor's representative, you're free to bring whoever you want to the entrance conference. Whether it's yourself, and maybe one or two other people, or it could just be you, right? So that's certainly your decision there. In some situations, like I said, if it's a very large audit or a very high profile audit, sometimes the contracting officer may be invited. Okay. Now, the entrance conference, again, this is a very important part of the audit process. One of the things we'll discuss is the purpose of the audit, right? So DCA will discuss, why we're performing the audit. We'll talk about our overall plan, what are the audit objectives. Okay. What I used to do whenever I was a supervisor is during the exit, I would also provide the contractor with a copy of the audit program. Okay. So remember, when I talked about, in the intro presentation, I talked about the standard audit program. Well, I would literally print that out and I would provide that to the contractor during our exit conference. So that's one of the things that I would do. So, that's something that maybe DCA would do if they had an entrance conference with you. Okay. So some other things that we could discuss, maybe arrangements for any necessary workspace, right? So again, DCAA, if it's a large audit, we may ask, hey, can we come to your work site? When we review documents, obviously it's much easier to come to you to review some of these documents, right? Now, I realize, in today's environment, it's a little bit different with COVID and everything. And also, a lot of these documents may be electronic to begin with, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I know when I was an auditor, a lot of contractors still had paper documents as their source documents. And so, going to the contractor site was very common to review those types of documents. You also want to have the contractor designate primary and alternate officials with whom audit matters are to be discussed during the course of the assignment. So again, if you have other people that you want to be involved, if you want us to coordinate things through somebody else instead of you, right? That's kind of what they're talking about there. All right. Again, this is some additional information that we may discuss in the entrance conference. Okay. We may ask you questions about, hey, what kind of array structure do you have? What's your organization? Provide us maybe an org chart. We may ask about your policies and procedures. We may ask if other audits have been performed and if there were any deficiencies and what were those corrective actions. Were there any relevant internal, external audits? Okay, maybe you have your external auditors come in and perform audits, right? And then we'll also ask, if you're aware of any suspected fraud affecting the audit subject matter. Okay. So again, just understand a lot of these questions, we ask these because it's relevant to the audit and it's important, but also our auditing standards, specifically that the last two, I believe our auditing standards require us to ask certain questions. Okay. So one of them is going to be, obtaining an understanding of any suspected fraud affecting the audit, and then also, incorporating any internal or external audit results, right? So just understand these aren't questions that we, kind of pick out of thin air. Some of this is also driven by our auditing standards, okay? And so the entrance conference itself, right? The whole concept of the entrance conference is actually driven by our auditing standards. Our auditing standards require that we have this entrance conference with the contractor, okay? Okay, now, I talked about the assertion, reviewing for adequacy. I also talked about the entrance conference. The next sort of touch point or milestone is going to be what's called a walkthrough, okay? And typically this is done either shortly after the entrance conference, or in some situations, it can occur in the same meeting as the entrance conference, okay? And so typically the purpose of the walkthrough is to sort of understand in more detail the actual subject matter of the audit. Okay, so for example, if we're auditing your incur cost proposal, okay, the walkthrough may, include, or, the walkthrough would consist of us asking specific questions about the incur cost proposal. Okay, so we may ask you certain questions, right? We may ask you to walk us through how this was developed, okay? We again, I think the biggest area with the walkthrough would be is just sort of asking questions, right? So again, during the assertion, during the adequacy review of the assertion, the audit team is going to review it for adequacy, but on top of that, we're also going to review it, and if we see things that we don't understand, right, those are things that we're going to note down. We're going to jot those down, and we're going to ask you. Typically, we'll ask you through the walkthrough. Okay, so that's really the biggest thing with the walkthrough. And again, if it's a very large audit, we may have a separate entrance conference and a separate walkthrough. If it's a smaller, more routine type of audit, we could probably do the entrance and walkthrough in the same meeting. Okay, now after we've done all that, right? After we've done, we've had the entrance conference, we've had the walkthrough, okay, we are then going to send a notification letter to the contractor communicating certain information, right? Again, this is required. This is a requirement of our auditing standards, okay? Now, the information that we send you is going to be no different than what we discussed in those meetings that we've had, right? So the letter itself is going to sort of document things like, was the audit requested or was it planned? Okay, we'll provide you our audit assignment number, the audit objective, the compliance criteria, the scope, management's responsibility, the auditor's responsibility, and then what to expect and when. Okay, so again, all these things, should be communicated to you during that entrance conference. And then after we have that and the walkthrough, then we're going to send you a notification letter, sort of just summarizing kind of everything that we've discussed at that point, right? That's kind of the purpose of this. Okay, interim discussions. Now, I've talked about adequacy review. I've talked about the entrance conference. I've talked about the walkthrough. Shortly after that, we send you a notification letter. At that point, that is when DCAA is pretty much ready to conduct the audit itself, to actually conduct the audit, right? So all this kind of everything that we've been doing up until this point has been what we call the planning stage of an audit, right? So where we gather relevant information, okay, we're doing certain things to look at what's risk, what's a risky area, what's not a risky area, right? So all this information we're doing up front, this is all the planning stage. Once we have all this information, we now have a clear picture of what we want to do, right? And that's the actual conducting of the audit. Now, during the audit, during the other term you may hear is field work, right? During the field work, we're going to have interim discussions, Okay, so that's very important, right? So throughout the audit, the auditor will discuss matters with the contractor and request additional support as necessary to obtain a full understanding of the subject to audit. The discussions will often disclose to the contractor any factual matters noted in the contractor's assertion records or supporting data. So basically, what we're saying here is during the field work of the audit, we're going to, it's very common for DCA to reach out and ask questions. We're going to ask, for supporting documentation. If we find something, okay, we're going to come out and we're going to say, hey, I found this. Can you explain it? Right? So that's kind of what we mean by disclosed factual matters, right? And every audit is going to be a little bit different. So the questions that we ask, will be a little bit different as well. The types of documents that we look for might be a little bit different. But in general, this is kind of what you're going to see during every audit. Now, once we get through the audit, through the field work, as I said, right? Once we gather all the information, once we review all the information, once we've, conducted all of our audit objectives, we're now going to arrive at some sort of audit conclusion, right? So that happens, at the completion of the field work. Okay. In addition to that, we're going to have what's called an exit conference, right? So very similar to the entrance conference, the exit conference will be held with the contractor's representative and also with DCAA. And we're going to discuss with you the results of the audit, what we found, okay? We're also going to provide the contractor also has the opportunity to provide additional information or a written response to our findings and conclusions. Okay, so again, this is all required by generally accepted government and auditing standards. Now, very similar to the entrance conference, the exit conference, depending on the size of the audit and if it's a high profile type of audit, we may have the contracting officer invited there to attend the audit or to attend the exit. Okay. In some situations, even if there are no findings, sometimes we'll still have an exit conference. Actually, we're still required to have an exit conference if we have no findings. It's still a requirement. We may not have a big formal sit down if there are no findings. It might be something as simple as, hey, I'll call you up and say, hey, we completed the audit, no findings, and then we just sort of go our separate ways. Okay. So again, everything's going to just depend on the circumstances, but generally, this is what you're going to see. Okay. Now, I want to take a minute here to talk about some of the audit opinions. All right. So again, when DCA performs an audit, our final product is an audit report, which contains an audit opinion. So, I think it's good to sort of understand what these audit opinions mean. Now, the first one here is the unqualified. This is the best, right? This is the one that every contractor wants to get, because what this says is basically the contractor's proposed amounts comply in all material respects with the solicitation terms related to pricing. So basically, DCA, we performed an audit and we didn't find anything, right? There was nothing significant enough to report. That's essentially what this says. A qualified opinion, however, is a little bit different. Okay, and so basically, a qualified opinion says, hey, we performed an audit. Nothing came to our attention except for these certain things. Okay, so these certain things do not comply in all material respects with the solicitation terms and conditions, right? An easy example might be, let's say we audit your incurred cost proposal and everything looked fine except for, let's say, these $10,000 worth of unallowable expense, right? I'll just say bad debt expense, right? Because FAR says that's unallowable. Okay, so that's what a qualified opinion means, right? Everything looked good except for these things here. Okay. Now, adverse, right? The contractor's proposed amounts do not comply with solicitation terms related to pricing. Now, the difference between adverse and qualified is the amount, right? Is the amount of so what we find, right? And I'll use dollar amounts because that's sort of easy. It's easy to quantify that. Okay, if your, let's say your cost proposal, let's say it's a $10 million cost proposal, and we found $5 million where you were unable to justify with adequate cost of pricing data. Okay, well, that's a significant amount, the $5 million, as it relates to the entire assertion, right? The entire assertion is the $10 million cost proposal. Okay, so adverse is really how significant are those amounts, right? Whereas a qualified, okay, it may not be significant to the total, assertion, but it's still amounts that we found that did not comply with, solicitation terms or conditions, right? Disclaimer is the final one, and this is probably the least, it's probably the worst opinion that we can have. Basically, what we're saying here is we don't have an opinion, okay? So a disclaimer of opinion states that the auditor does not express an opinion. Okay, disclaimer is appropriate when the auditor has not performed an audit sufficient in scope to enable him or her to form an opinion. So basically, we couldn't perform our audit procedures. As a result, we don't have enough information to render any opinion. Okay, so and like I said, this is the worst opinion because, if you think about it, our audit report goes to the procurement community, right? The procurement community are the ones that make, procurement decisions. Okay, and so if we're talking about an incur cost, the ACO is the one that determines your final and direct rates. Okay, we assist the ACO in doing that by providing an audit report. If we provide the ACO with an audit report and we have no opinion, then technically, I mean, that doesn't help anybody. Okay, so that's why this is considered the worst or the least desirable audit opinion. Okay. Now, site visits, I mentioned this earlier during the entrance conference, we'll coordinate site visits with you. So auditors will be at the contractor site during the audit. Typically, this is during the field work. Site visits could include main locations and other satellite locations. So again, site visits are important. I realized during COVID, last year, it was very difficult. And I know DCAA was doing a lot of alternative, very just doing other things to kind of overcome this. I haven't spoken to the field recently, so I'm not sure what's happening with site visits, but I do know DCAA is still working remotely, to the extent possible. So we still might be limiting our site visits or just coordinating those so that we ensure we kind of meet all safety protocols. Okay. Okay, request for information. So this is also important. I mentioned during the field of work, DCAA would request information. So typically we do this either written or oral requests. Okay, and we ask contractors to provide cost or pricing data or other supporting documentation. Now, the general expectation is when we ask for this information, we ask that you provide this to us in electronic when possible. Okay, we also ask that you provide this, it's a timely response, right? I mean, our audit, the length of our audit largely depends on how timely a contractor can be. Okay, we also ask the contractor to ask for clarification if you're not sure what we are asking you, and that's very common. A lot of times I find, DCA will say, hey, contractor, can you give me this, right? And a contractor may not. Sometimes if this is your first audit, or if you're just unsure of what you're being asked, sometimes that could be an issue as well. So if you're not sure, please, ask for clarification. And then also provide support in an organized fashion. So, if let's say we're asking for travel documents and also timesheet data as well, it would be nice if the data was separated, and not just all jumbled together and given to us in a big pile, right? So, that's just one example, but, this is your data, this is your information. So, I personally would think it's easier for you to organize it in a way that we could then review it in a much easier manner, right? So again, that's all going to help, us in terms of performing the audit in a much more efficient manner. Okay. All right, and that's it. That's the end of the audit process presentation. Okay, I'm going to pause.
Thanks, Joseph. That was great. We only seem to have one question, which is, are there any guides or instructions from DCAA that a small business can follow in order to be DCAA compliant?
Well, no, there isn't. I mean, so first of all, there's no such thing as being DCAA compliant. That's kind of a misnomer. That's, I don't know where that started, but I've heard that all my life, my career, at least in DCAA, I've heard people just kind of say DCAA compliant. So there's no such thing as DCAA compliance. As you know, we have the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, which governs all, any business. If you want to do work with the federal government, the FAR governs that. And then you have more specific instructions are in the DFARS. And so that is regulations related to DOD. So if you have a DOD contract, then you have to follow not only FAR, but also DFARS. Okay. What DCAA does, what we do, is we just make sure that you follow those regulations, whether it's DFARS. Other agencies have their own supplement. NASA has their own supplement. Department of Energy has their own supplement to FAR. So if we're auditing you, all we're doing is making sure that you're following those regulations. Okay, and all those regulations will be in your contract, right? Within the terms and conditions of all of your contracts will include all of these regulations. All right, and so when we audit you, all we're doing is simply just making sure you're following those rules and regulations. That's all we're doing. So there's no magic formula to this. There's no checklist, in terms of being compliant. It's just, quite honestly, it's your responsibility to know what those regulations are and to make sure that you're compliant with it. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, there don't seem to be any other questions, so we can wrap up. Finished a little bit early. So what I will do now is I will send out the slide deck, so you have that, and the recording will be available tomorrow afternoon. Well, just anytime tomorrow, really. So I'll put a link in the email to you with that, so you can watch the replay or share it with your colleagues if you want to. I hope you've found this information to be useful to you. I know Joseph always explains it really well so that we can understand it. So I appreciate that. And I believe we have you coming back in December for another class. So yes. I will send out the link and I'll also put it in the chat box as well, so you can sign up for further instruction and training with us. So thanks so much, Joseph, and thank you, everybody.
May I ask a question, please? Sorry, I couldn't type fast enough before you started talking.
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you for this presentation. I think it's great because it's this whole mystery about DCAA that some of us small businesses, we're having a hard time understanding and even know where to begin. We are a small business. We've recently got onto a BPA, Navy BPA, and so we know eventually we're going to have to do something to get our accounting ready for an DCAA audit. However, we've been approached many times by a third-party solution software claiming that they are sort of like, I know you don't like using this term, DCAA compliant, and I know the government has made great efforts, spend a lot of money trying to simplify processes like DCAA and accounting for small businesses, so that we don't have to spend the money with a third party tool. Now, is this something that you recommend that we pursue, or do you think it's not worth it?
Well, so I mean, to be honest, I don't have an opinion either way. That's a personal business decision that you have to make on your own. But what I would say is, I think it really benefits all small businesses to have, at the very least, a kind of a minimal understanding of the regulations. I realize you're very busy and you have a lot of other things going on, but ultimately it is your responsibility. So, maybe having some basic level of understanding of the regulations, and that way, and then once you have that, I think you can make really good informed decisions about whether you want to hire a CPA, or go with a consultant, et cetera, et cetera. I will say I've heard from other small businesses that there are consultants out there that sort of, they know there's a lot of small businesses that just don't know what they're doing in terms, in the area of accounting. And so I think sometimes some of them out there may take advantage of that. And so I think that's something you need to just be careful about. So.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, well, thank you. Unless there's any other questions? No? Okay, well, we'll wrap up. And like I said, I'll be sending the slide deck out to you shortly. I put a link in the chat box to further PTAC training, so please take advantage of it. It is free for you to participate, and it's always a wealth of knowledge from people like Joseph. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.